Welcome to Scholarly Sedition with your host, Andrew Krishon. On today's first inaugural podcast, and my first inaugural podcast, I've never done a podcast before, we will be covering the early history of America. In the future, I hope to bring in guests and things like that, but for this podcast, I'm just going to go over some quotes said by the Founding Fathers and then analyze a few of them a little. Some of them I'll just read in their own. So, Albert Gallatin of the New York Historical Society, as the Bill of Rights was coming out, the U.S. Bill of Rights, not any of the state Bill of Rights, the U.S. one. In 1789, he said, "The whole of the Bill of Rights is a declaration of the right of the people at large, or considered as individuals. Not group rights, but individual rights." With that last sentence being my commentary. So what does that mean in regard to the right to bear arms? Well, obviously that means it's an individual right, according to Albert Gallatin, the premier historian analyzing the Bill of Rights as it's coming out. Who better would understand the intent of the Bill of Rights than him? And as Thomas Jefferson said, on every question of construction of the Constitution, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. But, what does this mean to you or me? Do I care what the Bill of Rights means, or what Thomas Jefferson thinks about how people should interpret it? Does the government care about this? I think to some extent it does. The American government, where there is an explicit constitutional limit on the government, banning dissent and non-state approved speech, doesn't do it as often as, say, the UK, where this constitutional limit doesn't really exist, hasn't been recognized by the courts, whereas in the US it has. So, it kind of depends on what the courts think, and then it depends on how much the executive is tied by the courts. We saw, during Katrina and the oil spill, some federal judge issued an injunction to Obama, and Obama just ignored it. So, these things, I don't think he'd ignore the Supreme Court, but he's supposed to follow all the federal courts when they issue injunctions, and he doesn't really. Maybe if they all started issuing injunctions, he would. I think the Bill of Rights matters to us today to some extent. It'd certainly be great if it were adopted by the government. And some people say that U.S. history has just been a downward spiral from this glorious moment when we rebelled against the British and passed the Bill of Rights and the government was libertarian. Then it gets more and more status from there on out. That's certainly one interpretation of history. But it doesn't really seem to be the correct one. Consider, on this episode of Scholarly Sedition, the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were passed very shortly after the Bill of Rights. In 1798, about 10 years later, the government was in the midst of an undeclared naval war. Sounds familiar? Yeah, we're doing that today. The Founding Fathers never would have had an undeclared war like Obama's done. Well, yeah, they would have. They did. They called it a quasi-war, is how historians term it. Yeah, I guess Libya is a quasi-war. I mean, it was pretty real if you were in Libya, but to the U.S. maybe. Anyway, there were all these xenophobic, immigration restrictions put into place at about the same time. The Naturalization Act increased the residency requirement for American citizenship. And don't kill me, I'm reading some of this off Wikipedia. Hey, I trust it more than the encyclopedias. I do. From 5 to 14 years. So the green card would transition to citizenship back then, much better than today's system. But it took, it used to take 5 years, and then it went to 14 years. This is under Adams, but the Congress, of course, writes the legislation, except for executive acts. So, this golden period didn't really exist, I think. Some people said the 10 years prior. Well, George Washington did round up an army and invade, the rest of the country pretty much during the Whiskey Rebellion. It'd be kind of like if, Obama took a bunch of National Guard troops from Massachusetts and marched them down to, Texas to put down the militia there, the local government there, A lot of these territories that rebelled in the Whiskey Rebellion didn't have real local governments. They were almost de facto anarchies. The militia, I guess, was the local government, and they rebelled against the whiskey tax and, hanged tax collectors and stuff. And Washington came in with his troops and crushed them. So, even in 1793, the 10th Amendment, and remember, if these things are supposed to talk about individuals, what does the 10th Amendment even mean then? Does it mean all powers not reserved to Congress are reserved to the individual? What about in regions that weren't states? Was the militia, the local, whatever de facto government there was, if you want to call it self-government or anarchy in some of these places in the far west? Historians have made that claim. Google the not-so-wild West. Anderson and Hill have a great history of that era. But this is, far in the West that a few pockets Anderson and Hill have labeled anarcho-capitalisms, back where the Constitution and Bill of Rights were in effect. They were failing miserably. The central government was invading the local government, violating the 10th Amendment. A central bank was passed when a strict reading of the Constitution didn't really allow for one. Undeclared wars then in 78 and the Sedition Acts. Sedition, what is that? What does that mean? What is the definition of sedition? That's, let's go to the dictionary, not Wikipedia, but just the dictionary. Conduct or speech inciting people to rebel against the authority of a state or monarch. Conduct or speech inciting people to rebel against the authority of a state or monarch. And that sounds like, any sort of speech that I'm interested in, wasting my time watching on, YouTube or Facebook or when I'm at work. This is the type of stuff that interests me, and I Google rebellion and things. It's fascinating, and I'm doing a podcast about it. So anyway, I guess just outlawing fun is what a law against sedition would mean to me. But it's a terrible thing, and it was passed right at the beginning of the Bill of Rights. So the Bill of Rights failed very early, very quick. And then I guess the laws were repealed or something, and Lincoln jailed people for speaking out against them. The Espionage Act, I believe, in 17 is still in effect. And people have been tried for it recently. Drake, the famous NSA leaker, because he leaked a document to the press, was tried for sedition. Let's go to, news. Google News. Sedition. How is this being used worldwide? We go to the Malaysian Insider. Lawyers have, ganged up to prosecute a DAP assemblyman under the controversial Sedition Act. This is in Malaysia. So this is a legislator who's being jailed by the prime minister, by the executive. So pretty much the executive is quashing the will of the legislature by jailing him for, rebelling, I guess. Although legislatures rebelling against the executive, they're supposed to kind of own the executive. The executive is supposed to be slave to the legislature. The military, the police are not the highest power. The legislature is in this constitutional theory that almost every country adopts nowadays. They've kind of copycatted the founding fathers model to at least a vague extent and have a legislature and executive, and the legislature rules the executive. But in most countries, that's kind of a sham, and how, the myth of state. And I think in the U.S., that's true to a big extent. So sedition is used kind of as a dictatorial, prosecution against sedition is used as a dictatorial power grab in much of the world. And I think this was a large part of the Alien Seditions Acts, too. John Adams was prosecuting an undeclared war, which is a dictatorial move, and Congress, squashing his dictatorial ambitions wasn't something he wanted, so he made, criticism of himself. In fact, that was the definition of sedition kind of at the time, is if you criticize the president, he could jail you for it. And by doing this, he definitely put Congress in its place as well, because who got to determine who got jailed? That was the president. He's the executive chief cop. Congress could be jailed by the cops for speaking out against the president, and that limit their ability. It's like, Congress is supposed to be the master. It's like the master not being able to rule his kingdom, just a defective arm Congress becomes when the king emerges. And I think some people have said it's better to just have a de facto monarchy. Hoppe says that. I think you might be able to make that argument for very small territories, Disney World size things, where there's just, absolute property rights owned by a single entity, Disney World. I think it would, like Luxembourg is like this, and I think does relatively well under that system, although even that king's limited to some extent. I like the separation of powers, but especially on a large scale, just because dictators on a large scale have historically just always had the worst regimes in terms of body count. I think that's an empirical fact. And Hoppe, I guess, argues monarchy on the small scale, and I don't think he really retracts that on the large scale. We're getting into Austrian economics now. Let's keep this about the NAP. That was what Shanklin told me when he offered me the podcast. Try to keep it about the NAP. All right. So the non-aggression principle. How does that relate to all of this? The non-aggression principle, the foundation of libertarianism, I think. It's been identified, recently, kind of Walter Block, I think, is the great, prophet of this non-aggression principle, libertarian link. Rothbard, too, before him. And so the word libertarianism has kind of been joined to this non-aggression principle. Who was Rothbard? He was Mr. Libertarian. He really defined the movement right there. He's present at the start of the Libertarian Party. Dave Nolan, who really was an anarchist, is an anarchist. And Chris Cantwell has some good stuff about the Libertarian Party's anarchist leanings at its outset. The non-aggression principle means that no one gets special rights, first of all, under any principle, under any law. And Bastiat really originated this in its fullest, that badges can't possibly grant rights, since badges are, in any just system, what they represent. If I really have a badge with real legitimacy behind it, it's like being, maybe a mall cop could claim this, that the property owner in its fullest consents to what you're doing. If a neighborhood decides to, all form a neighborhood association, you can make the same argument, I think, but where else would the badge draw its authority? The higher power was used for the monarchy authority in Europe, that God, created the badge, created the crown, which then delegated to the badge. Bastiat brings this into, real scrutiny and says if the badge isn't protecting property, as delegated by the property authority, a representative government, and such a thing, I fully believe on a nationwide scale is impossible, where you won't have any pockets of, I don't think I grant my property rights to you. It always has to be imposed by force, Poor Rhode Island didn't want to join the Constitution. Congress threatened to declare war on them if they didn't join. They, said anyone headed to Rhode Island will be jailed for treason, and, Rhode Island had to join. I don't think you can ever find a historical example of a large political entity that wasn't created, through just extortion. Just, join, sign the social contract, or we'll invade, Some small ones, maybe. You can go Google the history of Luxembourg. It's an interesting history. No, not Luxembourg. What am I thinking of? Liechtenstein. I'm sorry. Anytime I've said Luxembourg in this podcast, go back and replace it with Liechtenstein. That's the monarchy that, Hoppe loves, and some Hoppe's fans have applied his theory to. It's like a very small, like Disney World-sized monarchy in Europe. Good personal liberty, respect them. And said they would allow individual secession of property owners, even at one point. But for something as large as, the United States, and its Constitution, and even something I think smaller like the state of New Hampshire, I think it could really only be, a badge of a state police trooper could only really be just by, or could never really be just. So Bastiat said, look, the badge doesn't grant rights. If you, or I can't do something, the person with the badge can't. Because, the individual property owner doesn't have any rights. Doesn't have special rights that some other person doesn't have. So, yeah, you can control what's happening on your property, but nowhere else. You don't get to delegate power to some badge and then storms your neighbor's property and takes taxes from him, or stops him from smoking weed or whatever. It's not something you have the power to do. And the policeman doesn't have the moral power to do, the moral authority to do. And, Bastiat is seldom identified as an anarchist. For some reason, anarchy is a very new term to this school of thought. The classical liberals, a lot of them, kind of identify with this school of thought, but were inconsistent when it came to some policies. The libertarians like Mises approached it with no people and no part of a people shall be held against its will in a political association that it does not want. That's a quote by Mises. Rothbard kind of finalized it. Molinari preceded Rothbard, but wasn't very widely read. And Rothbard didn't, coin the term libertarianism, but popularized it. Liberalism had been demolished at that point, stolen by the socialists. And so an old socialist term, libertarianism, kind of got picked up by this foundation of the individualist foundation of classical liberalism, who, some socialists, such as Spooner, had picked up on. And finally, it was brought into this term libertarianism. So the Bill of Rights and the Constitution fail. So what is a libertarian government? I think it's a self-government. It's a government of myself, by myself, and for myself, and no one else. You don't have any authority to rule me just because you have a badge. Some may call this anarchy. Anarchy gets mixed up into a lot of other things like egalitarianism, between the sexes, like uber feminism, where men and women don't have any differences in society whatsoever. The average pay is the same for them, and all this stuff. Like uber democracy and all these other theories get mixed up with anarchy. But real anarchy, I think, just means that self-government is the norm instead of arbitrary invasion of property by the police. So, the property owner, it self-governs. If he doesn't self-govern, then he is not really the property owner. His property has been stolen. And, the state, kind of by its existence, has typically been very invasive of property. To operate, it must, extort people into paying them money to run its police force. A few states without taxation have been where, fines are against real aggressors, pay the police. Some libertarian authors have written about things of this nature. Early Ireland, early Iceland, you can call them stateless to some extent, but there is very much self-government. There's a system, indeed. There was a system, but competition existed, and so there was no true monopoly imposed on everybody in the same way, at least as there is under a typical state. Now, maybe some people say anarchy is impossible, so we're always going to have some aggression, so let's minimize it. Let's have a minarchist state. Just because anarchy is like a square circle, it doesn't exist, it can't happen. Again, I recommend anyone read Hill and Anderson's paper, The Not So Wild West, David Friedman's work on early Iceland, Rivalry and Superior Dispatch, a paper that came out of George Mason University about competition in courts in towns in early England, different legal systems operating side by side, no monopoly. Anarchy in the Aiken about Ireland is a great paper. I recommend reading I think it's Pennsylvania's Anarchist History by Rothbard. I think these give glimpses of what a world where there is no, violent aggressor against property in charge will look like. And I think in those worlds, whether you want to call them true anarchies, I think they're closer to anarchy than what any state has produced. I think you make the argument that, and these scholars do make the argument, that violence was very small compared to a state society, all state societies. So, self-government, taken to extreme, as Mises said, no people and no part of a people shall be held against its will in a political association that it does not want, is how to really enforce this notion Bastiat had. Of badges only representing rights, if they exist. So I can wear a badge that says, I have rights granted by me. I can police my property. If Joe allows me to police his property as a private security guard, I wear a badge that says, me and Joe. I don't get to police Fred's property if he hasn't given me, permission. And there's no president. And that's the kicker is, there's no presidential elections. It'd be a huge social change. God. Maybe parts of the U.S. could secede and try this, That will happen before the whole country goes this way. I'd love the whole country to go this way. I think as soon as part of the world tries it, the rest of the world's going to see how superior it is that it won't be long before they catch up. Maybe it'll never happen. Maybe the state will always exist. But how do we arrive at this system is another good question. Or how do we at least preserve what little liberty we have? What does the Constitution give any advice? The Constitution is supposed to preserve liberty according to theory, in theory at least. Does it at least give any advice for what happens under an unconstitutional government? Or does the Constitution just assume that it will never be broken? Does it not plan for that scenario? A few constitutions do, not the federal constitution. That doesn't, but the New Hampshire state constitution does. It says, under Article 10 of the Bill of Rights, the right of revolution. Now, New Hampshire starts its constitution out with the Bill of Rights, whereas the federal constitution added one kind of at the end as an afterthought under political pressure. So Article 10 of the New Hampshire Constitution, the Bill of Rights, says, government being instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the whole community, and not for the private interest or emolument of any one man, family, or class of men. Therefore, whenever the ends of the government are perverted, and the public liberty manifestly endangered, and all other means of redress are ineffectual, the people may, and of right ought to, reform the old, or establish new government. The doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power and oppression is absurd, slavish, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind. So, resist is what the Constitution says. And it doesn't just say, it's a great thing to resist. It kind of says, well, look, the doctrine of non-resistance, people who disagree with us, the doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power and oppression is absurd. You're absurd if you are against resisting. It's slavish, you have a slave mentality, Mike Shanklin, kind of the godfather of this podcast, has this page, a fantastic page, Statism is Slavery. Great term, you're slavish, I don't know how to pronounce that word, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind. It's kind of just a big, whatever political philosophy you believe in. Very few people openly say they want to destroy the good and happiness of mankind, so it's just kind of an umbrella appeal to, you're an asshole if you disagree with us. So, I guess a little divisive, it seems almost like Cantwell could have written it. But, what does that mean? How do you resist? Does it have to be violent resistance? The Founding Fathers obviously used a lot of violence, but maybe you can resist in your other actions, your peaceful actions, such as maybe using Bitcoin, using Tor to evade taxes, evade regulations through using the Silk Road. The Crypto-Anarchist Manifesto is a great paper I recommend to anyone who is interested in peaceful ways to destroy the government's power. Because first of all, the Crypto-Anarchist Manifesto was written in 1988, and here I'm Googling it right now. It is a document produced by Tim May that predicts the next 25 years to a T. So, it's a great document just because of that. I don't care what your political philosophy is. It's very accurate. Just fantastic document. It's not too long. I'll probably read it in its entirety here. I can't believe I promised Mike Shanklin an hour. I'm at the halfway mark now. We'll see what the hell I'm going to fill up the next 30 minutes with. But the Crypto-Anarchist Manifesto was written by Tim May to the cypherpunk movement, and cypherpunks, also identified as crypto-anarchists. As crypto-anarchists and cypherpunk were synonyms. Other famous cypherpunks were Satoshi Nakamoto, who my personal suspicion is Tim May, actually, but that's just a theory I have. But anyway, Satoshi Nakamoto was a cypherpunk, and he identifies as such. Tim Bell is another famous cypherpunk, author of Assassination Politics. Tim May, famous cypherpunk. Werner Vinge was kind of the predecessor and godfather to the cypherpunk movement. His book on Anarcho-Capitalism, The Ungoverned. Fantastic book. And the cypherpunk movement, is anarcho-capitalist. Crypto-anarchists are anarcho-capitalists. Cody Wilson might disagree. He's gotten kind of a little leftist for my taste lately, but Tim May, the person who really fleshed out crypto-anarchism and wrote the manifesto in 1988, identifies as a crypto-anarchist in Stateless Societies, one of those books. Contact me if you want the source on that one. And he says it is crypto. It's not, freedom from inequality or something silly like many anarchists say. It's, anarcho-capitalism that no one else governs your property but you, and your property being your data. So crypto encryption of the data means that only you can unencrypt it. It's privacy from state invasion. And when in a world where data becomes the most important form of property, then encryption means anarchy because the state can't get at it. The state can't control what it doesn't know. And so let me read to you the Crypto-Anarchist Manifesto, written in 1988. A specter is haunting the modern world, the specter of crypto-anarchy. Computer technology is on the verge of providing the ability for individuals and groups to communicate and interact with each other in a totally anonymous manner. Two persons may exchange messages, conduct business, and negotiate electronic contracts without ever knowing the true name or legal identity of the other. Interactions over networks will be untraceable via extensive rerouting of encrypted packets and tamper-proof boxes which implement cryptographic protocols with nearly perfect assurance against any tampering. Reputations will be of central importance, far more important in dealings than even the credit ratings of today. These developments will alter completely the nature of government regulation, the ability to tax and control economic interactions, the ability to keep information secret, and will even alter the nature of trust and reputation. The technology for this revolution, and it surely will be both a social and economic revolution, has existed in theory for the past decade. The methods are based upon public key encryption, zero-knowledge interactive proof systems, and various software protocols for interaction, authentication, and verification. The focus has until now been on academic conferences in Europe and the U.S., conferences monitored closely by the National Security Agency. But only recently have computer networks and personal computers attained sufficient speed to make the ideas practically realizable, and the next 10 years will bring enough additional speed to make the ideas economically feasible and essentially unstoppable. High-speed networks, ISDN, tamper-proof boxes, smart cards, satellites, Q-band transmitters, multi-MIPS personal computers, and encryption chips now under development will be some of the enabling technologies. The state will, of course, try to slow or halt the spread of this technology, citing national security concerns, use of the technology by drug dealers and tax evaders, and fears of societal disintegration. Many of these concerns will be valid. Crypto-anarchy will allow national secrets to trade freely and will allow illicit and stolen materials to be traded. An anonymous computerized market will even make possible abhorrent markets for assassinations and extortion. Various criminal and foreign elements will be active users of CryptoNet, but this will not halt the spread of crypto-anarchy. Just as the technology of printing altered and reduced the power of medieval guilds and the social power structure, so too will cryptologic methods fundamentally alter the nature of corporations and of government interference in economic transactions. Combined with emerging information markets, crypto-anarchy will create a liquid market for any and all material which can be put into words and pictures, and just as a seemingly minor invention, like barbed wire, made possible the fencing off of vast ranches and farms, thus altering forever the concepts of land and property rights in the frontier West, So too will this seemingly minor discovery out of an arcane branch of mathematics come to be the wire clippers, which dismantle the barbed wire around intellectual property. Arise, you have nothing to lose but your barbed wire fences. Timothy May. At an unknown date in the summer of 88. And Timothy May kind of went missing around the time when Satoshi Nakamoto appeared. So no one really knows where he is to contact him and ask him exactly when he wrote this, as I've been trying to do. I'm still trying to track him down. I'm getting my DeepNet stuff set up because I've heard he makes appearances in certain DeepNet chat rooms from time to time. I'd love to interview the guy. Yeah, how would that be for a podcast? I'll interview Tim May. Maybe he'll come out as Satoshi Nakamoto. No, that's just a crazy theory I have. I don't even think anyone else has the theory that Tim May is Satoshi Nakamoto. But anyway, I guess I have 25 minutes to kill on this podcast, and I'll just spend it discussing the Crypto-Anarchist Manifesto. It was the first half of the podcast, I guess, was involving the founding fathers and, early America and liberty and stuff of that nature. But I kept on asking, how does it apply? How does it apply? Well, maybe here's how it applies. I mean, there's certainly, other ways to resist besides crypto anarchy. Old-fashioned ways the founding fathers would have used in that. That I don't want to discuss in too much details, so I don't go to prison or anything. But scholarly sedition. Yeah, well, I'm not actually trying to get arrested for sedition, though it's such a goddamn ambiguous thing. I'm not sure. Maybe I will, because they can. Hopefully they'll go after some lower hanging fruit than me first, like Santelli, the media guy who kind of orchestrated the Bundy situation. The media guys always orchestrate every physical revolution. Sam Adams pretty much started the whole Boston Tea Party. He ran the Boston Gazette, and the Boston Tea Party was planned in the neighbors' back rooms. Pretty much to troll the British into getting them to put, to react back, and very provocative, kind of like Cody Wilson being provocative. So anyway, hopefully I won't get arrested for sedition, or at least I'll see other people getting arrested first, and know to get the hell out of the U.S. Where would I go? I don't know. Maybe Russia. Putin seems to be nice to people being charged with sedition. He took Snowden in. At least U.S. people, and just don't criticize him when you get there, because he arrests everyone in Russia who exercises sedition, or just poisons them. Anyway, the Crypto-Anarchist Manifesto. Getting back, I said I'd discuss that for the remainder of the podcast. So let's go through it, line by line. Let's talk about how Tim May's predictions came true, and specifically, what they mean for liberty and sedition, because that's what the podcast is about, after all, I guess, scholarly sedition. So, computer technology is on the verge of providing the ability for individuals and groups to communicate and interact with each other in a totally anonymous manner, is what May wrote in his first sentence, and it has now. Tor. Two persons may exchange messages, conduct business, and negotiate electronic contracts without ever knowing the true name or legal identity of the other. And electronic contracts really getting set up is something that is a bit lacking in implementation compared to other aspects of this. Armory now is multi-sig transactions, so escrow can begin being used with Bitcoin. And Ethereum, if that's actually going to be a thing, is coming out soon, ostensibly. So electronic contracts, in the sense of just, verbal contracts sent electronically, written contracts sent electronically, yeah, but true self-enforcing electronic contracts, which I think is what May was really getting at with that sentence, are probably a year or two away. Interactions over networks, this is the next sentence, interactions over networks will be untraceable via extensive rerouting of encrypted packets and tamper-proof boxes which implement cryptographic protocols with nearly perfect assurance against any tampering. This is Tor. And the only party's wrong is nearly perfect assurance. There's complete perfect assurance if you use, 256-bit encryption. You can always encrypt faster than you can unencrypt. So any encryption breaking software the NSA develops will always be exponentially far behind just the power it takes to bump up the encryption a level to beat it. Just move to 1086 or whatever they're at, go up to 10,000-bit encryption, require the NSA to have a computer as big as the universe to even begin thinking about disencrypting it. This can be done with poor computers today. Encryption is very memory, not very intense in terms of capital required to invest in computers, so perfect assurance against tampering. Reputations will be of central importance, and the Silk Road, this is the next sentence, reputations will be of central importance, so he obviously predicts the Silk Road with that part, far more, because that was reputation based, far more important in dealings than even the credit ratings of today. These developments will alter completely the nature of government regulation, the ability to tax and control economic interactions, the ability to keep information secret, and will even alter the nature of trust and reputation. Well, the nature of trust and reputation is definitely altered in that an anonymous entity has trust. Who that is, how many people it is, really completely unknown, and you could always create as many of these anonymous entities as you want, but that anonymous entity gains trust. So yeah, this is how the Silk Road operates, or its spin-offs. The Silk Road went down, but there's 1,000 flowers blooming, plenty of other online marketplaces. And the government, can't control what it doesn't know. It can't regulate tax or control economic interactions, as May predicted. It can't keep information secret. Snowden, the London government tried to invade The Guardian, and it destroyed the Snowden files. Big whoop. They have it up on the encrypted cloud. There is zero ability. The more that is moved online and encrypted, the less the government can control anything. The less the government sees even exists. The government, a group of people issuing orders when the orders don't mean anything, aren't a government. So we can end the state's existence and get back to a more libertarian, not getting back as in the founding was libertarian, but get to a more libertarian reality. That's just the first paragraph. So accurate. Let's move on. The technology for this revolution, and it surely will be both a social and economic revolution, has existed in theory for the past decade. The methods are based upon public key encryption, zero-knowledge interactive proof systems, and various software protocols for interaction, authentication, and verification. And this is Bitcoin, pretty much, and all, the encrypted chat software, Tor, they all use this technology. Moving on. The focus has until now been on academic conferences in Europe and the U.S. Conferences monitored closely by the National Security Agency. Yes, the NSA was very interested in the cypherpunks and the crypto-anarchists, and they've always remained interested in encryption. The feds tried to ban encryption briefly in the 90s. PGP encryption, look up the Wikipedia article on PGP for more on that. Because, encryption is the enemy of the NSA. It is. The cypherpunks are the arch enemy of the NSA, the crypto-anarchists. It's like a, villain and hero sort of thing for liberty. Moving on. But only recently have computer networks and personal computers attained sufficient speed to make the ideas practically realizable. And really, it would be 20 years before the average person can afford a computer to really implement Bitcoin, and the next 10 years will bring enough additional speed to make the ideas economically feasible and essentially unstoppable. Yeah, really the next 20 years, I think he was a little too optimistic, but it didn't miss too much. high-speed networks, ISDN, tamper-proof boxes, smart cards, satellites, Ku-band transmitters, multi-MIPS personal computers, and encryption chips now under development will be some of the enabling technologies. He was accurate. Third paragraph out of 5. 15 minutes to fill. I guess I'll go slower. The state will, of course, try to slow or halt the spread of this technology, citing national security concerns, use of the technology by drug dealers and tax evaders, and fears of societal disintegration. The state did, of course, try to slow and halt the spread of this technology. Encryption was almost banned in the 90s. The state still treats encryption as a munition. The state forced Cody Wilson to take his plans for 3D printed guns offline. The state forces you to unencrypt in certain instances in court, or you'll be disobeying a court order. The state tries to, get rid of any leaked classified material. National security concerns. The more that people know, the less powerful the state is, because secrets are power, information is power, knowledge is power. The technology has been used by drug dealers and tax evaders who, after all, the drug dealer is just using his property, the tax evader is just keeping his property by libertarian standards, by standards of personal liberty. The person leaking national security secrets, well, Snowden, what property is he violating by leaking this? The U.S. government is illegitimate, so a contract with it can be broken without, infringing on just moral authority, just moral property. And then May goes on and says, many of these concerns will be valid. Crypto anarchy will allow national secrets to be traded freely and will allow illicit and stolen materials to be traded. Indeed, the black market that's now enabled on Tor, has no morality police, and anything can be traded. Who knows? I don't know for certain, but I would suspect slaves are being traded on that by now. So this isn't some sort of, all of humanity's moral problems will be solved. A person can still be stolen from, beaten, enslaved by his neighbor, but some general government won't be doing it. If the general government doesn't exist, it is withered away by becoming powerless. It's not a utopia, but it is a better world. May goes on. An anonymous computerized market will even make possible abhorrent markets for assassinations and extortion. Markets for murder, hitmen markets. And indeed, you can just see how May's prediction has come true by looking up the Forbes magazine article. Let me just Google it real quick. The article is titled, I've probably looked at this article so many times, I'm on all sorts of NSA lists. You have a show called Scholarly Sedition, Andrew. Of course you're on NSA lists. Alright, so the article's titled, Meet the Assassination Market Creator Who's Crowdfunding Murder with Bitcoins. So this is what May predicts. It's happening. Everyone's got a price. Bernanke's got one. It's May's theories come true, and May says it's abhorrent that this will happen. Tim Bell, another cypherpunk, is more friendly towards the idea. He says that's how government's going to wither away. Konkin, kind of the agorism godfather of the crypto anarchy movement. Konkin kind of was very influential on Vinge, who was very influential on the cypherpunks. Konkin discussed how the state would be withered away kind of by this method. And I'm not going to obviously endorse it or I'd be arrested, but, I'll probably get kicked out of Pork Fest for this anyway. But, so this is just how to discuss, the intellectual thought around this. You have to understand what the cypherpunk movement was, what crypto anarchy was. Whether you don't have to endorse these things, just understand what the early history. And Tim Bell, it was a founding cypherpunk who was very influential, and so you can't deny that just because this stuff is so controversial. And their predictions were right, so they're of note because their predictions are right. You don't have to be a crypto anarchist to agree that their predictions were correct. So May goes on. Various criminal and foreign elements will be active users of CryptoNet, but this will not halt the spread of crypto anarchy. Criminal and foreign elements. Sounds like, some sort of Senate committee hearing by, aspiring senator. Criminal and foreign elements are using CryptoNet. Feinstein, maybe. So, of course, the government will try to stop this, and of course, there'll be all sorts of terrible stuff, going on. Just look up the BitLocker virus. That's a horrible thing. But, this is just a force of nature at this point. The government would have to shut off the internet, which it probably is capable of doing if it just uses nuclear weapons against its own people, but which really it doesn't want to, and to some extent can't. So, this is withering away the state. The last paragraph. 9 minutes to go. I'll have to really go through this one slow. Just as the technology of printing altered and reduced the power of medieval guilds and the social power structure, so too will cryptologic methods fundamentally alter the nature of corporations and of government interference in economic transactions. Combined with emerging information markets, crypto anarchy will create a liquid market for any and all material which can be put into words and pictures. So printing altered and reduced the power of medieval guilds and the social power structure. Here's one thing I think May missed was 3D printing, or he would have referenced it because it fits in here perfectly. So the 2D printer kind of completely altered the power structure of Europe. The Bible was used to govern Europe, and no one could read it because it was only in Latin and copied by monks. Then versions of the Bible in the local language came out and could be read by the masses. Protestantism emerged. The medieval guilds who did the printing and had the monopoly on copying and being literate, the monks lost their power. So the 3D printer, destroys the guilds of today, the corporate complex sanctioned by the state on firearm manufacture, the patent complex, sanctioning certain producers who are in the patent system and outlawing others who aren't. This guild structure, the union guild structure on the monopoly on labor being used to produce things. 3D printers really disempower the guilds of today. And 3D printing coupled with crypto anarchy means, so for instance, Cody Wilson's gun design you put up on the web can never be taken down because of crypto anarchy. And Cody Wilson is a great crypto anarchist. He, he's a little too anti-capitalism for me, but I like Konkin. He, goes into how the state can never take away these designs. The state can outlaw 3D printers. They're very do-it-yourself now, though. In fact, I predict the fall of the Chinese state, or at least Chinese totalitarianism, with regards to political speech. I predict the fall of that probably within the next couple years because of 3D printing and crypto anarchy tour and all that. So there is a huge power shift going on, similar to the power shift when literature became widely available due to the 2D printer. And cryptologic methods, as May puts it, are completely intertwined with this revolution. And the revolution is impossible without it. Combined with emerging information markets. And probably the majority of stuff that's being traded now is information, even in the state-sanctioned market. Crypto anarchy will create a liquid market for any and all material which can be put into words and pictures. And, scarce material, of course. So bitcoins, can be encrypted. designs for guns, and there's a joke on Reddit, you can encrypt your design for a dildo, you can encrypt it with a double wall partition, so when the feds see it and force you to encrypt it, you unencrypt a gun. You do this in Mississippi, or Iran, and up north in Massachusetts, you disencrypt it and have it be a dildo when, it's really a gun. So it depends on whether you're in a left or right state. You can use double partitions that way, but, there's no way the government can control anything that can be put into words or pictures, which is money now, Bitcoin, which is all sorts of physical things now because of 3D printing. National secrets, Snowden. Beyond the state's control. And just as a seemingly minor invention like barbed wire made possible the fencing off of vast ranches and farms, thus altering forever the concepts of land and property rights of the frontier west, so too will the seemingly minor discovery out of an arcane branch of mathematics come to be the wire clippers which dismantle the barbed wire around intellectual property. The death of intellectual property is what May predicts, and May's prediction has come true. There is no more intellectual property in music. Some people choose to pay for music, but you do not have to. There is no more intellectual property for anyone who has a 3D printer and patents for what it can print, and 3D printers are getting better all the time. 3D printers are printing houses now. Metal 3D printers can make fully functioning AK-47s. Patents, intellectual property, the crypto net, as May puts it, Tor as we would call it today, destroys all of this. It is similar to, going back in time and reversing the flow of time between when you had property for ranchers with fences and then when you didn't before them. And I think Colorado still has, you have to put up a fence to keep cows off your property. They can still freely range, instead of having to put up a fence to keep your cows on property. But, so property is really defined by technology. And this technology changes everything. It, certainly, getting back, I guess, to the first part of this podcast, the old-fashioned, the founders and all that, it certainly merges the First and Second Amendment. When the government tells Cody Wilson that he's not allowed to publish 3D printed gun designs on his website, they're infringing on his speech. It'd be insane to argue otherwise, but the government must do this if it wants to control guns. It has traditionally disrespected the hell out of the Second Amendment. And it is now, just in order to maintain its monopoly on infringing the Second Amendment, in order to keep that line in the sand, if we get to control your guns, which it was losing the power to do with 3D printed, and as metal 3D printers become cheaper, really the government's ability to control fully automatic weapons is going to become null and void. So it has to draw this line in the sand, but first of all, it thinks it has to, but really it shouldn't have, and it's a failed attempt, because once something's on the internet, you can't take it down because of crypto anarchy, because of Tor, barring some fundamental change to the structure of the internet, maybe an EMP blast, and then the government invades everywhere and prevents people from setting up decentralized net and puts a more central, you'd have to have crazy nightmare situation to ever get these things off the internet. So they're there for good, they're there to stay. And, the First and Second Amendment are kind of blurred now into just liberty is the same thing. And the government can't control it. Freedom of the press for the 21st century means the right to bear arms and produce your own arms. 3D printing. Freedom of the press, means the freedom to submit information online, to send information online. But that in turn means monetary freedom because of encrypted money, because of Bitcoin. Complete monetary freedom and death of taxation. These things are all, coming into being because of crypto anarchy. And, some of the more seditious parts of what the founders wrote, or what Tim Bell preached might end up coming true. I won't get into them. I'm not trying to get arrested for sedition, but even if they don't, I think the state might still disappear very shortly. Maybe 10 years, maybe 5 years, maybe tomorrow. I don't know. Maybe when Glenn Beck becomes an anarchist, the state will finally go. Anyway, at the hour mark, so signing off.